The world's on fire. Our river's gone dry. The rich are getting richer. They've left us out here to die. Mass migration. We got no place to hide. Who's against us? Who's on our side? Are they too dumb or are they just in on it? Liars and cheaters, a red hot grip. Ditch the gaslighting gas bag that speaks in code. He's a faker, a shaker, a pontificating pantload. In this house of mirrors, we've hit the wall before it's too late. Let's go. Come on, y'all. It's border to border and coast to coast. It's real, it's facts, and it ain't no hoax. It's Podcast by George, and it's showtime, folks. Well, there you go. Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. It's TGIF, but there's not a lot to be thankful about other than the fact that it's Friday. Got a lot of news today, man. Brad Wolf and I were talking before we came on the air. It's all bad. There's nothing good that's happening in the news right now. At least, real news, things that you need to be concerned with. And I want to show you the big three on Podcast by George. We're going to be talking about this stuff today: climate, war, and healthcare. That is the PBG big three. And joining us on the Podcast by George live line today is Brad Wolf, a former prosecutor, professor, and community college dean. He's co-founder of Peace Action Network of Lancaster, partners with World Beyond War and Peace Action National. He's also an organizer of the upcoming Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. And we're going to be talking about that a lot. Brad has published articles in the Progressive, Counterpunch, Common Dreams, where he's got an article right now we're going to get to, antiwar.com, Consortium News, and Peace Voice. And, the article in Common Dreams has to do with the fact that we need to break through this propaganda thing that we're immersed in. We got to start thinking for ourselves. We got to start thinking like this guy. And we're going to talk about poetry, but I'm going to bring this up on screen here so that people can see this. The great Bob Dylan. He's big with me. He's big with Brad. I'm huge. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit. The Masters of War song that he wrote. It says, "Come, you masters of war, you that build all the guns, you that build the death planes, you that build all the big bombs, you that hide behind walls, you that hide behind desks. I just want you to know I can see through your masks. Let me ask you one question. Is your money that good? Will it buy you forgiveness? Do you think that it could? I think you will find when your death takes its toll, all the money you made will never buy back your soul." I mean, Bob Dylan, my God, blowing in the wind. He is, and he's moved away from that somewhat in his writings of late, but he is the voice of a generation, mine still, when it comes to peace and war. But let me click a couple of buttons here so that we can bring him up on screen and take that away and bring this up over here and say good morning to our guest here, Brad Wolf out in PA. Hi, Brad.
Hi, George. How are you? Happy New Year.
Yeah, that's right. Happy New Year to you too, pal. I got to do some cleaning here, housekeeping on some news of the day. A couple of things here that I thought you might be interested in commenting on. And I actually posted this on my website and Facebook pages. It has to do with, I call my news, what in the hell news? Read this. Past U.S. presidents, VPs, asked to recheck for classified documents. Now, we know that so far, Trump, Biden, and Pence have all been found with these classified documents. The National Archive has asked former U.S. presidents and vice presidents to recheck their personal records for any classified documents following the news that President Joe Biden and former Vice President Mike Pence had such documents in their possession. Spokespeople for former presidents Trump, Obama, Clinton, and former vice presidents Pence, Dick Cheney, Al Gore, and Dan Quayle did not immediately respond to requests for comment. Now, you got to remember, Joe Biden was on 60 Minutes. Kind of taking the higher ground here, criticizing old Trump for having those classified documents. It turns out that Biden's got them everywhere but the glove box of his Corvette, it seems like. Freddie Ford, the chief of staff to former President George W. Bush, suggested in his response to the archives that Bush's office did not believe a search was necessary, saying, "Thank you for your note. We understand its purpose and remain confident that no such materials are in our possession." God, you want to talk about wordplay? You want to look at what he's saying there. They remain confident that no such materials are in our possession. Yeah, are they or not? It turns out that officials from all levels of government discover they are in possession of classified material and turn it over to authorities at least several times a year. Now, that's according to another person familiar with the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity due to the sensitive nature of classified documents. Brad, I talk to people on my show all the time. Anytime you hear from an anonymous source, look critically at what you're being told here. And I gotta wonder whether or not this is actually true, and why would anybody need anonymity to make a comment like this? Okay, so here's the final page of this. It reads, it's against federal law to have classified documents in an unauthorized location, but it's only a crime if it was done intentionally. Speaking Thursday at an unrelated news conference, FBI Director Christopher Wray said that though he could not discuss any specific ongoing investigation, we have had for quite a number of years any number of mishandling investigations. That is unfortunate. Unfortunately, a regular part of our counterintelligence divisions and counterintelligence programs work. Of course, we don't know about any of that because it's secret. He said there was a need for people to be conscious of laws and rules governing the handling of classified information. Those rules, he said, are there for a reason. Okay, that highlighting is mine. What the hell does that mean? What I posted on this, Brad, was, does it occur to anybody that Julian Assange is being held in Belmarsh? He's being tortured to death out there in solitary confinement, waiting extradition to the United States, which he is not a resident of, never had a business with, for espionage here in the United States, for publishing classified documents so that we, the people, know what the hell is going on. And these guys, the oligarchy, the political leaders, are apparently, it looks to me like anyway, spiriting away these classified documents. It looks to me like they're hiding them. They're keeping them to themselves. And I got to ask the question that nobody's asking, Brad. What the hell are those classified documents all about? How did they happen to choose the documents that they have in their possession? I'll bet Assange would like to know that too, but unfortunately he's locked up.
He is. And, you can list Julian Assange, you can list Chelsea Manning, Daniel Hale, all of these people who are truth tellers release classified documents that the government never disputed, never said were false, said that they were true, but nevertheless, the simple release of them got them in trouble with the United States Department of Justice, and they're facing decades in prison. So these classified documents, and the problem with presidents and vice presidents taking them when they leave office, is probably as old as the Republic. I know it goes back to the Kennedy administration. When that administration cleaned out, they took documents. Sometimes it's for, intentional purposes. I would imagine sometimes they do it for nefarious reasons. They want to cover up certain things. Other times I can see it being done just out of the hectic nature of having to move so much documentation out of the office into storage somewhere. But given the fact that we live in a national security state, you'd think that we would have better procedures to cover classified material. This material is classified for a purpose. So we would not want this just out there for anybody to see. And the fact that it could end up in a garage, in a storage unit, in somebody's desk at Mar-a-Lago, in Biden's place, it's very concerning. There seems to be selective prosecution here. One for those who release it and provide some embarrassing information, though it's truthful, and then another for those who leave office and, quote, maybe accidentally take it.
The way that this is, the analysis on this, they look at old Trump, he didn't even box his up. He didn't get he was going to stay until after the January 6th fiasco, the riots, the deadly insurrection in Washington, D.C. So they're saying he's mostly at fault because he refused to turn these things over when asked. He took them away, bunches of them, and hid them. And the sheer volume of what he had has a lot to do with criticism of him. But I look at it and think, I kind of look at it in the reverse fashion. Trump grabbed a bunch of stuff. Maybe he didn't know what exactly was in there, like what you're talking about. When I look at Pence and Biden, they didn't have nearly as much stuff. And people say, well, that's good news. No, I don't think so. Why did they select? Why did they curate? Why did they just take a smaller amount of something? What the hell was in those classified documents? I got to know. I'm telling you, that's what I'm really interested to know.
And hopefully at some point we will know. If prosecutions go forward against these individuals, maybe we'll know the general topic area. We're not going to see the documents, but at least we would know, is it about Taiwan? Is it
Yes.
about, January 6th? What is it about? The public deserves to know this is supposedly still a democracy, and we are entitled to this kind of information. We don't want to release information that puts lives in jeopardy, but I think we're entitled to know generally what's going on here. And as
Yeah.
I said, in a national security state like ours, we need to have better procedures in place so this doesn't happen.
Yeah. And Assange would tell us again, but he ain't here, folks. Let me bring this up on screen. We got to move through so many things quickly. Again, this is just some housekeeping here at the beginning. And this is a war and peace issue. It's a war in Palestine, a war between them and Israel. The Israelis killed 10 in the West Bank. And I brought this up. I wanted to show this to Brad because these circles here on this photograph are mine. This is out of the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. Israeli forces on Thursday killed 9 Palestinians, including at least 7 militants and a 61-year-old woman. This highlighting is mine in the deadliest single incident in the occupied West Bank in 2 decades. That's significant. I didn't realize that. It's according to Palestinian officials. Now, this Jenin refugee camp, this is where Shireen Abu Akleh was killed, was murdered, the famed journalist. And I had a lot on my show on that. I've mentioned it several times. I ain't forgetting it. I'm not going to let that drop, folks. Everybody else seems to be willing to. That's definitely been shuffled under the rug. But here, take a look at this photo. People that are watching the video can see this. Palestinian protesters hurl stones. This has been going on, I think, as long as I've been alive. I remember reporting on this kind of stuff back in the 80s, Brad. Here's a dude, no shirt. You can see his hand up. He's throwing a rock there. They're burning some stuff in the street. Some bottles over there that might be thrown. I thought maybe those could be Molotov cocktails. I don't know. But the point is, why are the Israelis shooting people that are throwing rocks? Yeah, well, have you ever been hit by a rock? Well, yeah, I could see why. But take the guns away and throw rocks back. Throw projectiles back. I mean, I don't want to be facetious about this, but get some pictures out there and throw some rocks back at these people, and probably nobody's going to be shot and killed. I mean, that's kind of a juvenile way of looking at this. But again, they talk about bringing a knife to a knife fight. Well, bring a rock to a rock fight, Brad.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you dig a little deeper about this particular event that happened, it looks like the Israeli forces went in to raid an apartment where they thought terrorists were hiding. They went in at 7:30 in the morning in a commercial vehicle, stormed it, began shooting, and that immediately followed with tanks and bulldozers coming through the streets, tearing up everything in its way, cars and everybody else. Reports are they were just shooting indiscriminately. And as you pointed out, a 60-year-old woman was killed. A 15-year-old boy was also killed. They've yet to release his body. They said they will not release it for a funeral because they fear that the timing is not right, that tensions are still too high. So this is, as you said, it was the deadliest day so far. Last year, I think 173 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces. And make no doubt, it is an apartheid state, what is happening there. The conditions in Gaza are horrible. You have 1.5 million people basically living in the world's largest prison. They're denied rights to vote, to have any say in their government. They're living in conditions where they lack water and sewer facilities, proper food. They're constantly under bombardment. And as you say, when they respond with rocks and they fire artillery into Israel, they certainly do that. The retaliation is of an extraordinary level. And it doesn't seem that this is something that anybody has an interest in ending. I am against violence on any side. And I think that this constant state of war that Israel and Palestine are living in can't continue. They really need to sit down and figure this out. Israel's harsh new government is not going to succeed in resolving this issue. And the Palestinians obviously are not going to stop. They believe that they're in an occupied territory and that, they have rights. If you would reverse it and you would think, in America, if only white Christians were allowed to participate in office, in electoral office and vote, you'd be horrified at that thought. But that's essentially what's going on in Israel now in those occupied territories.
Yeah, I want everybody to remember Shireen Abu Akleh. I mentioned her as well. And to Brad's point, is exactly what's going on over there. It's really no mystery. I think the Israelis would like to mystify it. I had the great Chris Hedges on my show, the Pulitzer Prize winning war correspondent, and he's I've been there. He says I know all about this. And this is when the first reports of Abu Akleh being killed. Where he said that was on purpose. He says that was not an accident. That was not stray gunfire. He said they put a bullet right in underneath her helmet line and the back of her head above her flak jacket, and that was a murder. Guess what? Further investigation, Chris Hedges knows what he's talking about, folks. That's what we're dealing with over there. All right, I got to keep moving here. I got to get these other stories. This one I mentioned on the show uh, a little bit. I know Brad has followed this very closely. The doomsday clock. This was on Tuesday, folks. The doomsday clock 2023 says the world is closer than ever to global catastrophe. The doomsday clock was moved forward Tuesday to 90 seconds to midnight, due in part to worries about Russia's veiled threats of nuclear warfare. I've got the video here. It doesn't take very long. Let me show you the unveiling here.
It is now 90 seconds to midnight.
There it is. That's the unveiling. I want to read into this a little bit because there's an angle on this that I hadn't considered, and it comes from the great Caitlin Johnstone. I want to bring that up. The world is closer to annihilation than it has ever been since the first nuclear bombs were released at the close of World War II. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist said Tuesday the time on the doomsday clock moved forward from 100 seconds to midnight, 100 seconds to midnight, to 90 seconds to midnight. Now, it's a reset of what has come to be known as the Doomsday Clock, a decades-long project of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, featuring a clock face where midnight represents Armageddon. My God, folks, this is a 12-hour clock. We're shown as being 90 seconds before midnight now. Between Russia's nuclear brinkmanship and the war on Ukraine, the real threats of climate change becoming increasingly dire, and ongoing concerns about more possible pandemics caused by humans encroaching on formerly wild areas, the bulletin chose to set the clock the closest to midnight yet. Okay, I wanted to, so I read this and I thought, that's pretty cut and dried. And Brad, you can weigh in here on this. Here's an angle from the great Caitlin Johnstone that I hadn't considered. But boy, this was an eye opener. The bulletin, Caitlin says, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has moved its symbolic doomsday clock to 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been. And reason for doing so, increasingly dangerous war in Ukraine. Now, I talked about propaganda just briefly at the beginning, and it's like drip, 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 little pieces and bits of it everywhere, and it forms public opinion. It's so massively effective. It is who we are today. She says a statement authored by the Bulletin's editor, John Mecklin, is as biased against Russia as any mainstream Western punditry today, and makes no mention of the U.S. empire's role in provoking, prolonging, and benefiting from this conflict. Yet, it still provides a fairly reasonable appraisal of the magnitude of the threat we're staring down the barrel of at this point in history. And she says the most common response I get, I'm sure you do too, Brad, I get this kind of stuff, I get is something along the lines of, well, if there is a nuclear war, it will be Putin's fault, and though whose fault it is still matters to us while we're watching the world end, along with the related, well, Russia shouldn't have invaded then. And, well, Russia should stop threatening to use nukes then. People, she writes, genuinely don't seem to understand that in the event of a full-scale nuclear war, it will really be the end of everyone. They still kind of imagine everyone still being there and shaking their fists at Russia afterward, and themselves sitting there feeling self-righteous and vindicated for correctly saying that a bad, bad man Vladimir Putin is. Okay, let's bring Brad back in here. I don't want to read too much. I hate doing that when I've got a guest on here, but I got news for you. There ain't going to be no Rachel Maddow if this happens. You're not going to be able to tune in Sean Hannity. I mean, NBC Nightly News is not going to be on televisions. We're going to be a cinder block orbiting the sun, folks. That's what they're talking about here, Brad.
It is. And JFK said the same thing during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, if the generals are wrong, if my generals are wrong, they know that they're not going to be around. None of us are going to be around to tell them that they're wrong. And that's true here. This idea of whose fault it would be becomes irrelevant when the bombs start flying. So Frida Berrigan recently wrote an article called "The End of the World is Back Again." And, we really thought at the end of the Cold War, we were over that. And I didn't think we would get to the point where we were 90 seconds to midnight. It's extraordinary that we are. And that video that you showed, it was a very solemn, sober video, rightfully so. This is a very dangerous time. And though the scientists did put the blame to a degree on Russia, saying, Russia's threats of nuclear war have pushed it there, that mainstream media is running that issue as if it matters. It's not going to matter if nuclear war begins, whether it's with a small, low-level tactical warhead or not. There's a famous story when we're talking about mainstream media about during the Cold War, Soviet journalists came to America for a week to tour around. And at the end of the week, the American host asked the Soviet journalist, "What did you think? What were your impressions of America?" And they said, "We were amazed. We read every major newspaper and they all say the same thing on the vital issues. And we watched every television news program and they all say the same thing on the vital issues. In the Soviet Union, we have to build lots of prisons and pull out fingernails to get that to happen. How do you do that here?" And that's typical. That's kind of what we're up against here with the mainstream media.
Yeah, and of course, the doomsday clock. A couple of reasons that it is ticking down, and climate is right. It also is up there with it, and these pandemics and the possibility that more are going to be released, and not from a wet market in Wuhan, folks. That thing came out of. I know it came out of a lab, and I want to know who is responsible for that. That's kind of like those classified documents. That's my main concern with the pandemic right now. But let me bring this up on screen, Brad, because this has to do with what the bulletin was talking about, and also Caitlin Johnstone. This is from the Associated Press. Russia plays down the West's move on tanks, attacks Ukraine anew. Now, this is what happens, folks. This is what you get into. And this is what we're into right now. Let me read this just a little bit. From Washington to Berlin to Kyiv, a Western decision to send battle tanks to Ukraine was hailed enthusiastically. Moscow first shrugged it off and later launched a new barrage of attacks. And my God, knew this was coming. This is the escalation. This is what happens. Nobody wants to go to a negotiating table. Nobody wants to have a peace talk. They want to send these things in there. And guess what's happening? The Kremlin has previously warned that such tank deliveries would be a dangerous escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. And it has strongly denounced the watershed move by Germany and the United States. I heard a lot about Germany, but the United States is in this up to its neck to send heavy weaponry to its foe. But it insists the new armor won't stop Russia from achieving its goals in Ukraine. Get this is from Russia. The potential it gives to the Ukraine armed forces is clearly exaggerated, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said. Those tanks will burn just like any others. Moscow played down the move right after the announcement in an apparent attempt to save face. Again, I look at every single word. What the hell are you talking? This is a war. Save in the West raises the stakes in Ukraine. Some Russian experts also emphasize that the supply of the deadly armor will be relatively limited and could take months to reach the front. Well, not if I think we can get them there if we want to. Ukrainian officials long have expressed hope of getting U.S. F-16 fighter jets. Now, this is the Rubicon, and long-range rockets for the high-mobility artillery rocket systems known as HIMARS to hit targets far behind the front lines. Such desires groom ominous remarks from Russian diplomat Konstantin Garlov, similar to the kind voiced earlier by Putin and others. I want to turn this over to Brad, but I want to read this last paragraph because I thought, oh my God. If Washington and NATO give Kyiv weapons to strike peaceful cities deep inside Russia and try to seize the terrorists that constitutionally belong to Russia, it will force Moscow to take harsh retaliatory action. Gavrilov told the meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, quote, he said, "Don't tell us then that we haven't warned you. Okay, Brad, I read that and I thought, oh my God. I mean, Russia is open to all kinds of condemnation on this. Like Caitlin says, they may have been provoked. But I've been following this pretty closely ever since it first broke out, Brad. And to me, Russia has been pretty much walking it like they talk it when it comes to war. I would believe them when it comes to this. And that's something that is beyond belief. You don't want to think about that.
I mean, that's pretty ominous language when you take a look at that. Those tanks will burn like any others.
Yes.
That's people inside those tanks. Those are human beings, and it's true. They'll burn, and people will die. Large numbers of people will die. There was a recent estimate put out that up to 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been wounded or killed so far, and 150,000 Russians. So these are extraordinarily high numbers of deaths occurring. And this tank issue, there's so much to unpack here. Um, One is the United States says they don't want to send the tanks because there's such high maintenance. They get 3 miles to the gallon of diesel fuel. They're problematic. They were sent to the Marines at one point, and the U.S. Marines sent them back to the Army because they didn't want them. They didn't work well enough. So that speaks to the whole issue of poor manufacturing by the United States and these overpriced weapons. But the other issue is something you and I were talking about shortly before the show began, and that is the idea that Germany is sending tanks as well. And the thought of German tanks fighting Russians raises the specter of World War II, which really strikes at the heart of Russia. We're coming up on the anniversary of the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, February 2nd, which was a horrific battle, close to 2 million casualties on both sides. And the Russians held out against just extraordinary odds and were willing to incur extraordinary casualties to win. And so that speaks to the issue of what they're willing to endure in this battle over Ukraine. This is right on their border. It's unlikely they're going to walk away. They have repeatedly said this is an existential threat, the expansion of NATO up to their borders, just as we would see a threat of Mexico inviting China in to put bases all along our southern border. We would perceive that as an existential threat. When the Cubans put missiles in Cuba in 1962, we did not see that as a Cuban provocation. We saw that as a Russian provocation. So it's the weapons suppliers that they're looking at, and Russia's looking at the United States as the provocateur here. And that's a very dangerous situation. And you can argue who's right and who's wrong, but perceptions matter in superpower relations. And when each side has approximately 6,000 nuclear weapons, you don't want to back the other side into a corner. You don't want to humiliate them. And so I wrote an article last summer called Boiling the Frog. And it's this idea, the old biology experiment where you put a frog in a pan of water and you slowly turn up the heat, right? And the frog doesn't realize he's boiling to death. Yeah. Well, the State Department and the Pentagon say that's what they're doing to Russia now. Russia's not a frog. They know what's happening.
Well, and I saw a military analyst not too long ago. He was analyzing the war in Ukraine, and he said one of the reasons the Russians have been somewhat constrained and have been conducting this war on their terms and appear supremely competent is because of this huge battlefield advantage they enjoy when it comes to armor, when it comes to tanks, basically. Well, you take that away, and then you get into the area of humiliation, like Brad is talking about, a nuclear power that feels humiliated and backed into a corner, or maybe worse yet, panicked. You don't want somebody that's got 6,000 nuclear weapons pointed at everybody in the world being panicked. And that may be what this is, the escalation issue that we're struck with. Not the other thing is, Brad, I'm going to hold this. I'm reading this. I had her on my show here. I'm going to get that. This is the war in Ukraine. Here we go. This is from the great Medea Benjamin. This is her new book. I had her on my show recently, and I wanted to show what she had to say about this on Twitter. Medea says Biden strong-armed Germany to send Leopard tanks. Now the U.S. will send Abrams tanks despite initial objection from U.S. generals. Yeah. Another step to direct war with Russia. Disastrous decision. We need peace talks instead. How about one? Let's have one peace talk, for God's sake. Let's have a serious set down. Why do we do all these types of things? We can send Abrams tanks and we can't take out a conference room? What the hell's that all about? Medea says, if you think sending tanks is going to give Ukraine the ability to take back all of Donbass and Crimea, which is largely what this is about from the Russian perspective, you are unrealistic. This escalation makes nuclear war, not victory, more likely, and that is a lose lose for all of humanity. And again, I recommend this book. I haven't got to it yet. It's not a big book. I just got to get to it and get it read.
Medea is
Medea
great.
knows all about this. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, she's awesome.
yeah, I know that you really like Medea. Is she with the War Crimes Tribunal? Have you approached her? Have you?
She's a partner. Code Pink is a partner of the War Crimes
Yeah, okay, that's
Tribunal.
what I thought.
So
Yeah,
yeah, and she was with us in Washington last November when we delivered the subpoenas. So yeah, she's great. The work she does and Code Pink does is incredible. And those tanks. One thing I'd point out about the tanks that we're sending, another issue the United States remarked about was that the training involved takes months, if not years, and so sending them was problematic on our side. I was in a phone call this week with an officer of the IRC, the International Red Cross, who has a lot of people deployed in Ukraine. And they said there's so much weaponry being sent to Ukraine from NATO and the United States, and the Ukrainian forces are not being properly trained on it, that it's resulting in a lot of friendly fire, a lot of Ukrainians being killed by this new weaponry that's being deployed. And so the tanks are a concern. If they're not being trained on something that sophisticated, who is it you're going to kill? That recent apartment building that was hit by the Russians, the IRC members said the missile that struck that was a missile that was designed to sink an aircraft carrier. So you can imagine the destructive power that had. And then there's recent reports, and I don't know if they're accurate or not, but I saw them this morning, that missile may have been deflected by Ukrainian air defense systems and it fell into the apartment building. So, this is a very dangerous game with incredibly powerful weapons and civilians taking terrible toll, in loss of life.
All right, so that's going to bring us here to what I really wanted to talk about today. And some of this is housekeeping. Some of this has just got to be reported. And Brad's got great perspective on this, but it has to do with the latest action from the Emergence of Death War Crimes Tribunal. And maybe to preface this, I'll play this clip real quick. Hopefully folks can hear this now.
Bids where they are making billions in dollars off of death and suffering. They foment needless war. They know that their weapons kill civilians, unarmed combatants, and yet they continue to rejoice and to revel in their profits. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, we will be going back to Washington, back to their headquarters to deliver a contempt citation, holding them and 3 other weapons manufacturers in contempt for failing to comply with our subpoena.
Okay, so that lays the groundwork here with this next action. It has to do with February 14th, Valentine's Day, which couldn't be more appropriate. And when I saw that clip, the one thing that jumped out at me, Brad, was that Lockheed Martin that you were outside? Okay, there's nuclear weaponry that taking place in there. I don't think a lot of people know that.
There is. That's in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour from me, right outside of Philadelphia. And it's a large plant, and they do manufacture nuclear weapons components in that plant. It was actually in 1980, the original site of the first Plowshares action, where Philip Berrigan and others went in to pour blood on blueprints and documents and blood on some of the nose cones of missiles and began the Plowshares movement. But we were out there on Martin Luther King Day, and there was a good turnout. I think there were probably 12 police officers there to greet us. They obviously knew we were coming. But it was a peaceful demonstration. And what I was talking about there is we are returning to Washington, D.C. on February 14th for an action called Melt Your Cold, Cold Heart. And we're going to be going to Raytheon headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. So please, everybody is free to join us. If you're listening and you're in the area on the 14th at 10:30 in the morning, we'll be at 1100 Wilson Boulevard, which is Raytheon headquarters in Arlington. We're going to have an action there where we're going to deliver a citation of contempt because they have failed to comply with the subpoena that we delivered to them last November 10th. That subpoena, we went into their office and delivered it to them and 3 other defendants as part of this War Crimes Tribunal. We asked them to turn over documentation evidencing their complicity in war crimes, and we listed the specific documentations in that subpoena. They had 90 days to turn it over. Those 90 days expire on February 10th, and so we're going there the 14th to issue this contempt citation for the War Crimes Tribunal. And we hope to get inside. They were not very welcoming last time, but we hope to get inside and also have a demonstration outside. And then after that, at 1 o'clock, we're going to proceed to the Pentagon. And we're going to get off at the metro station stop there at the Pentagon. And we have a subpoena for Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. And that is a subpoena compelling him to testify before the tribunal. And we want to deliver that to him, not only because he's behind so much of the war-making policy, but he is emblematic of the revolving door of somebody in the military he was on the Raytheon board, now he's Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
Certainly when he leaves this position, he's going to return to the corporation and make lots of money. So this revolving door, it's interesting, at Raytheon, at their headquarters in Arlington, they literally have a revolving door that you go through to get in, which was,
that is a little
symbolic
bit of And for people that don't know, I always think of Raytheon as the bomb maker. Right. They're the bombers, the mad bombers. That's where Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, came from. He was ahead of the board, wasn't he? I mean, This guy was a big kahuna at Raytheon. They brought him in to the Secretary of Defense office. Guess what he wants to do? Guess what he's going to do? Guess what his background is? I mean, some of this is, oh my God, are they too dumb or are they in on it? As I talk about, I want to read this for the people that are listening in audio now, Brad, that may not be seeing this. I've got the contempt citation up on screen. Merchants of Death, War Crimes Tribunal, people of the world. I like that. That's the plaintiff. The people of the world versus Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and General Atomics. And you and I talked about this briefly on the show before, Brad. A lot of people aren't aware of General Atomics. What is that again?
General Atomics is a privately held corporation. The other three are public corporations, but it is owned by the Blue Brothers. They're billionaires, and they make primarily drone weapons, which business is booming. And so the tribunal wanted to concentrate on conventional warfare, nuclear warfare, and drone warfare. And so we wanted to bring in General Atomics. Even though they're not that well known, they are a major player in this new emerging warfare, which is being billed as a surgical sanitized version of warfare, though it's not. So we visited their office as well. Their headquarters are in San Diego. And what we're doing is having coordinated actions across the country on February 14th. So we have a group in San Diego that are also going to deliver a contempt citation to the headquarters of General Atomics. We have groups in New York, in Massachusetts, and in places all over doing the same thing on the 14th. So if you go to the website, www.merchantsofdeath.org, you can see the subpoenas, and we're going to have the citation, this contempt citation, loaded today. And you will be able to download this. And if there is an office in your area, and I'm sure there is, because these corporations are very slick about how they deploy offices and factories around the country, deliver it on the 14th and take pictures and send it to the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal website. And we will post these because we do want to show coordinated actions across the country on February 14th for this Melt Your Cold, Cold Heart Day.
Okay, so I think I've got this up on screen. Am I in the right place? Okay.
You are.
This is how
you can see that top subpoena there is to the weapons manufacturers. That was our original subpoena that we delivered in November. The second subpoena is one that you can download. That's the one we're going to deliver to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Individuals can also download that because it's simply compelling a witness to testify, not charging them with a crime, but compelling them to testify. That can be delivered to your local congressman, your senator, bank presidents who are investing in weapons manufacturers, anybody you think has information that would be of value to the tribunal and is relevant to these charges of weapons manufacturers fomenting needless war. Serve the subpoena, use it as a political action, and go take pictures, have a little rally, send it to us, and participate in this. We want to build this across the country as much as we can.
Yeah, and you've already got some big names, including Cornell West. I mean, you've got some real muscle behind this thing. It's great. I love looking at the artwork and the photos and the production values here on the website. There's the great Carol Hartman, a friend of mine, that submitted some artwork. There's what Ukraine is quickly becoming like, particularly the major cities that have been under attack. Let me take that off of screen now and get back to this. Now, here's the contempt citation again. I'll read this. It has been made clear to the tribunal that you were served with a subpoena what, Deuces? How do you pronounce that?
Deuces take them.
Deuces Take-em on November 10th, 2022. See attached. You were provided 90 days to comply with said subpoena and failed to do so. Therefore, you are commanded to have a representative of your company appear before the tribunal to respond to the citation. Your acknowledgement of receipt of the citation must be sent electronically. Details on participating in the hearing for contempt of the tribunal will be provided upon receipt of your response. Okay. I'm not going to hold my breath for those people to do that, but I did want to bring this up on screen.
And again, the point here is if they have nothing to hide, produce the documents.
Right. Yeah. What's the problem? Yeah, exactly.
What's the problem there? This is taxpayer money. This is an extraordinary amount of taxpayer money.
Well, let's talk about taxpayer money. This is from Responsible Statecraft. I've got this up on screen now. The weapons industry giant's CEO announced the news on a call this week, a move that's effectively underwritten by us, the American public. So people watching the show, for instance, they're opposed to this. Well, you're a part of it, folks. The federal government and U.S. taxpayers are effectively underwriting massive returns for Lockheed Martin shareholders, returns so impressive that the weapons firm's CEO, James Tacklet, boasted about how the company handed $11 billion over to shareholders in 2022 via share repurchases and dividend payments, creating significant value for our shareholders. This is the problem with the blood money. Talk about this, Brad.
That is exactly what the tribunal wants to focus on. These weapons manufacturers are not just responding to innocent contracts from the Pentagon, but they're creating an atmosphere for war. And so that stock buyback, they're generating a 40% return for investors. So they need to continue to sell weapons at an extraordinary rate. And for all these weapons contractors who say we create jobs, well, what did they do with their profits? They didn't create jobs. They gave it back to shareholders to enrich those people who own stocks. So they're not investing in creating more jobs. That's taxpayer money. As I said, it's an extraordinary amount going to them. They are the largest weapons manufacturer in the world, Lockheed Martin. They merged with Martin Marietta back in the 90s at the famous last summer that Secretary of Defense under Clinton had at the end of the Cold War, where he brought the weapons manufacturers together and said, we're going to be cutting defense. You guys are going to have to merge. And all these mergers happened. And those weapons manufacturers said to each other, we can't compete in the private sector with economic conversion because we are very poor at competing in the private sector. We're used to cost overruns and not being held accountable. And so we need to find a war. We need to find wars, and expansion of NATO was one area for them to do that.
I think of Lockheed Martin, I talked about Raytheon. I think of them as the mad bombers. I think of Lockheed Martin as the missile guys. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yeah, and fighter aircraft as well. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They're fighter aircraft as well. Yeah. Their office is in Washington. Is amazing. When we went to Boeing's office, they have this enormous office there with ball fields and all kinds of things to make them look really innocuous and say that they're just building civilian airliners. But they're all hiding behind this idea of blood money. You know, this is not manufacturing weapons to support wars, but it's manufacturing wars to support weapons. So we're going to try to shine a light on that aspect of it. The tribunal is doing something that has not been done by other tribunals. Other tribunals have held the American government accountable for war crimes, whether it be Vietnam or Iraq. But we want to shine the light on the weapons manufacturers and the role that they are playing, because they have significant influence over members of Congress and how they vote, people in the Pentagon, and all the way up to the White House. So if we can shine a light on them, and we have got lots of people already testifying, video recorded, I have testimonies with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff to Colin Powell for many years, testified in an amazingly revealing interview about how this all works and the role that weapons manufacturers play in fomenting war. So we look forward to holding them accountable next November 2023. And hopefully this will result in the public being aware of the role that these people play and demanding change from congressional representatives.
Well, there's one big insult to the injury here, and you mentioned it outside of Lockheed Martin there. It's mentioned in that responsible statecraft thing. This isn't by accident. This is by design. This isn't where these companies are saying, well, we just make stuff and how people use it is up to them. They know what they're doing.
They absolutely do know what they're doing. They know who butters their bread. The lobbying efforts that they engage in on the Armed Services Committee members in Congress is intensive, it's specific, it's direct. They are getting upwards of a 4,000% return for the money they invest in lobbying compared to the weapons contracts they get in return from the United States Congress. So it is in their interest to be in the war rooms, to be in these think tanks that advise members of Congress. So these weapons corporations fund think tanks that provide white papers to members of Congress and people in the Pentagon and State Department that create hostile territories and a hostile atmosphere that needs weapons to support it. That article about wargaming with China and an possible invasion of Taiwan was indicative of exactly what I'm talking about here. The basic result of that, even though it's no one wins, is we need to build more weapons.
Yes. Let me read this now. We're going to get into this. And this is really the genesis for today's show. This is a great article that Brad authored in Common Dreams. And I have Common Dreams on the show a lot. People should follow that. Wargaming, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. No one wins. Again. No one wins. Now, this is interesting because I'm a big music guy, blues news and interviews. That was the original subtitle of my show. I mean, I have great faith and belief in all of these great musicians and songwriters and the peace movement and the integral role that they've played in this throughout the years, and poetry. We're going to be talking about that. You write that war is a language of lies, cold and callous. It emanates from dull technocratic minds, draining life of color. It is an institutional offense to the human spirit. And Brad and I have talked about this on an earlier show. This ain't natural, folks. And Brad, I want you to talk about that because I talk to people all the time that say, well, this is part of the human condition. We are warlike. This is who we are. This is what we do. It's always been with us. It always will be. But it doesn't have to be, and it isn't natural.
It is not natural, and anthropologists have researched this. And in 1985, there was a famous gathering of anthropologists who took about to study this very intensively. Is mankind inherently warlike? Have we always engaged in that? And their findings were very clear that this is a relatively recent invention, meaning government-supported systemic violence, where you're being told to take a weapon and go kill people you do not know. Violence in the human condition is one thing, but systemic warfare is another. They can trace it back about 10,000 years. That's as far as they can go. So the idea that this is a natural condition is false. Many civilizations have lived without war. Many civilizations live without war now. So something is feeding into this war narrative. With the United States, it's money. Capitalism has been a great driver of war, without a doubt. The other thing that leads into it is language. And that's what I was trying to get to in that article. Language is critically important. And the way the Pentagon and the White House and the mainstream media speak to us about war is very revealing, because they hide behind subtext. The military will use phrases like degrading the enemy. We are degrading the enemy. And I remember the first time I heard that was during Desert Storm, when Norman Schwarzkopf was said that we had degraded the Iraqi army in significant ways. And then he was pressed. They said, what does that mean? And he said, large numbers of dead. And he was pressed again. And they said, how many? And he said, upwards of 100,000 so far. That was stunning, to hear a number like that. Now, he didn't want to say that number initially. But I think it's up to us as human beings to talk honestly and truthfully about what happens in war. And that article, I cite one of my favorite poets, Carolyn Forche, who's just brilliant and has kind of developed a special genre of poetry known as witness poetry, where she talks about giving witness to war and brutality from totalitarian regimes. And her books, I encourage you, please go read her poetry. Just amazingly powerful words. And I think if we can begin to talk this language and we can begin to understand it, then war is not going to be so acceptable. It's not going to be antiseptic, something we just can flip by on the television show, but something we cannot look away from. The passage you have up there right now is very powerful.
Yeah, I'll read this for the people listening in audio now. You write that language can free our minds or imprison them. What we say matters. The hard, bare, truthful words of reckoning. Utter the words of truth about war, and the military can no longer continue its somnolent recital of death. And boy, that dovetails. That's a nice segue from the new book with Christopher Hedges when I had him on. This is what he's all about. We need to get a face to the horror of war that we're not getting from the propagandists. We're not getting from the mainstream media. We're not getting from Hollywood, certainly. I mean, this is ugly stuff. And the author that you cited here, she writes, a boy soldier in the bone-hot sun works his knife to peel the face from a dead man and hang it from the branch of a tree, flowering with such faces. Oh my God. There you go, folks.
You
This ain't
put
no
that
John
down.
Wayne movie that we're talking about
No.
here.
And you read that passage and you put the book down and you just put your hand over your eyes and you think about it. And, it is just powerful, powerful imagery. It is true. It is honest. It's what happens. It's what people are forced to do. And those are the kind of things we need to speak about. I wrote another article about music and how Bach saved the world, because music transcends all of these divisions we had. I wrote another article about dance called The Dance of Sympathy. And I do think the arts open us up to thinking as human beings rather than as military technocrats.
All right, we're just about out of time here. I want to get a couple of things. For one thing, I want to bring this up on screen because this is the great Mary Knox, a big friend of mine. Whenever she takes the time to watch the show and make a comment, I want to make sure that I get this on, have you respond to it, Brad. She says, Chris Hedges says weapons are our biggest export. Yeah, it's what we do. Our stock markets depend upon weapon sales. Yeah, I've talked about that on the show before. All of these retirement plans, all of these 401ks, I mean, their major shareholdings are these high dividend paying defense stocks and also oil and gas.
Yeah.
We lost most of our other manufacturing due to NAFTA and other trade negotiations. The United States doesn't have other things that we make, and that compared to weapons sales. A few automobiles, but few of those are 100% USA made. Yeah, and I mean, this is what the tribunal is all about, Brad. This is big business. It is blood money on steroids.
It is. And what does it say about a country that its main export is war? What does it say about our morality, our integrity, our respect for human life? These are things that we talk about the world over and say that, we want a rules-based order and respect for human life. And yet our export is war. We are the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. That's what Martin Luther King said in 1967. It's true today. And we could build so many other life-sustaining products rather than exporting war across the country. And when you build things for war, you obviously create an atmosphere that puts those tools to use in war. So we're not just, again, innocently selling weapons to country to defend themselves. The expectation is they're going to use those weapons.
Yeah, let me see if I can bring this up on screen here. Once I know this is
Yeah.
Bob Dylan's got a special place in your heart. I read this earlier. People can see it on screen. The Masters of War song that he wrote. Now, one thing about this, this was actually written not for the Vietnam War, which you would think. It was written for the Cold War that the United States was entering into, and this facing each other down with nuclear weapons, which we had had since World War II. That's what Dylan was writing about then. It couldn't be more prophetic today, Brad.
Yep. We named our son Dylan. Huge fan of Bob Dylan. And when you look at the third passage of that song, is your money that good? Will it buy you forgiveness? Do you think it could? Now, he wrote that back in 1962.
Yes.
It's that long ago, and yet it still is so true. He was insightful. He saw what was going on with weapons manufacturers. They were making money off of potential for nuclear Armageddon. And it's happening again today. And it really has to stop. We've got the power to stop it. We are the people, right? We're the masses. If we can unite around this common theme that we want to de-escalate and have economic conversion to a better way of life, we can do that. We do just need to unite different movements across this country and across the globe to make it happen. So I am optimistic about that part. I hope that we can do that.
Yeah, and quote Dylan again, don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters. Don't these leaders, these people that are on the news, that are in these articles, that are everywhere, the Lloyd Austins that you're talking about, all of the don't follow those guys. Follow Bob Dylan.
Right.
Follow Brad Wolf. Help follow Podcast by George. I mean, we need to have somebody lead the country that is not from these warmongering camps of politicians that are sitting on the world and killing us all. I mean, if it's a singer, if it's a songwriter, if it's an actor, I don't know what it is, but it ain't what we got, Brad.
No, it's not. Follow the poets, follow the artists.
Yes.
They're the ones that are sensitive, and they're sensitive to what's really going on in the world. They hear the voices, they hear the cries, and they're able to articulate it. So that's, again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of thinking and talking that language, because the military does not know how to respond to that.
That's an important point, and that's a powerful point that you're making in the article. So maybe wrap up with that, or anything that you want to give you a last word here. We've got a couple of minutes before we go. Tout the tribunal, let people know what's happening on Valentine's Day, and then as we move closer to fall 2023.
Absolutely. We definitely want to emphasize the 14th, Valentine's Day. So again, if you're in the Washington, D.C., Arlington, Virginia area, 10:30 in the morning out front of the Raytheon headquarters, join us. We'll have an action right there, and then at 1 o'clock proceed to the metro stop at the Pentagon for an action there to deliver subpoenas. That's part of the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal, all leading up to the tribunal itself, which is going to occur in November of 2023. So I would really like to highlight that part of it for now, and would look forward to maybe coming back after that, and I'll let you know how it went.
We'll be here. I can't wait to get the update. Folks, we've been listening and watching and looking at some film clips. Brad Wolf, he's a former prosecutor, professor, and community college dean. He's co-founder of Peace Action Network of Lancaster, which partners with World Beyond War and Peace Action Network in National. He's also, of course, the organizer of that merchantsofdeath.org War Crimes Tribunal. Go there, folks. Follow along. Be a part of it. You'll feel good about it, and maybe we can change the direction of this thing. I know Bob Dylan would like for us to do exactly that. At least I think that he would. The old Bob Dylan would have anyway. Brad, thanks again for coming on this podcast by George.
Thank you so much, George. Great job you're doing. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, let me see here. I've got a couple of comments that just came in late. Maybe there's something here. Let's see what we've got here from Mary Knox. ELP. Okay, this wrote epitaph. The wall on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams upon the instruments of death. The sunlight brightly gleams when every man is torn apart with nightmares and with dreams. Will no one lay the laurel wreath when silence downs the screams? Oh, my God. Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. My God. Yeah, that's from back in the day. That's great stuff. That's a good place to stop. Okay, we'll circle back, Brad. All the best, pal, and good luck on Valentine's Day. Yeah, for sure. And folks, I hope that you like seeing Brad Wolf, and you like seeing these comments from our guests, and following along with Podcast by George. And I'll leave the recommendation here at the end that I always do. The easiest way to make sure that you see each and every broadcast in video is to go to podcastbygeorge.com. Click on either the Facebook or the YouTube icons, the badges, the tabs that are there. It'll take you right to the site, and you can subscribe. It's all free, and you'll get notification when those release. Then if you like the audio-only versions, you just want to listen in your car or on your phone, go to iTunes. The little badge is there at podcastbygeorge.com. Also Spotify and Deezer and, all the places where podcasts are heard, and you can follow us there. But that is going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.